Hi, it's Dwyer. It's November 29th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, made a couple of videos on AJ against Jake Paul. The mood in the room, and that's important because that reflects the odds in the fight, right? It's hard after the fight to remember what people were thinking before the fight. But the mood in the room was that some of you were surprised to hear that Jake Paul was doing this and thought that the fight would never happen. Right? The feeling is that this is a publicity stunt and that Jake Paul is using AJ's name. There's no way anyone can take the fight seriously. Now, let me just make a few points. Folks, you've had some undersized heavyweight champions. Not that Jake Paul's undersized. Understand, Jake Paul weighed in the 220s. Against Mike Tyson, right? But you had guys like Ezra Charles, who beat Joe Louis. You have a light heavyweight champion, Billy Conn, who was beating Joe Louis, right? Just understand, this fight's only an 8-round fight. It's not like Jake Paul has to worry about another 7 rounds. This isn't the old days of 15 rounds. Where the heavier fighter actually has a chance as the smaller guy tires to catch up with him. You've had guys like Joe Frazier make a career out of fighting bigger guys. Right? You've also had another group, light heavyweights, Roy Jones, the most recent, who jumped up from light heavyweight to beat a heavyweight champion. Right? One of the most dominant champions I've seen in any weight class, particularly the heavyweight division, was Larry Holmes. Who took his title? It was Michael Spinks. Right? Spinks, of course, would go on to stop Jerry Cooney. So, I believe everyone needs to take this fight seriously. Jake Paul looks to be for real. Right? This is not a charlatan. This is not some entertainer who is, trying to, say, look at me, I'm in against some real fighter, and then try to make a mockery of the sport. Right, folks? He's beaten Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. So now, today, BoxingScene.com, please go to it. They have the guys he's sparring with. You can kind of tell how serious a fighter is by the guys he has sparring with him. Right? A while back I made a video where I talked about how Terence Crawford was sparring with Dimitri Bivol in anticipation for his fight against Canelo. Right? Well, folks, just want you to consider the fact that Jake Paul, and understand, Jake Paul is a CEO guy. He's a business owner. Right? He understands the big money is on the back end. Right? It's not the purse for the fight. He wins here. It opens the door. If he beats Anthony Joshua, what's to stop him from fighting a Tyson Fury? From fighting a Deontay Wilder? Right? Wouldn't the argument change from, am I worthy of getting in the ring, to how many ex-heavyweight champions am I going to beat? I've beaten Mike Tyson. I've beaten Anthony Joshua. Tyson Fury, come on down. Right? Usyk, are you going to risk credibility by fighting me? Understand, Jake Paul these days weighs more than cruiserweight. Right? So Jake Paul understands the opportunity, so he has hired a unique group of guys. I want people to think about the thinking that went into this. Fighter number one is Big Baby, Jared Anderson. Right now, folks, like AJ, and AJ's an athlete. Jared Anderson is an athlete. Right now, he starts faster than AJ. Right? I want people to look at the Jerry Forrest fight. Right? Jared Anderson is more emotional than AJ. Right? AJ comes in, he needs to look at the lay of the land. Jared Anderson comes in by his own admission. If he gets hit with some punches where he feels he has to defend himself, he's going to go all out. Look at the number of punches Jared Anderson throws in the opening rounds of the Jerry Forrest fight. Right, so you're dealing with athleticism here. So when Jake Paul hops in the ring with Jared Anderson, he'll get a feeling as to a sparring partner's athleticism. Anderson, of course, has a big punch, has an excellent overhand right. Anderson's ambidextrous, believe it or not. Anderson, in some ways, is more complicated than AJ. Right? Anderson has the foot speed to follow Jake Paul. Now, I'm not saying Anderson is the mandatory contender for anybody or that Anderson is on the very short list of the very best. To be blunt, I was surprised Martin Okoli was an underdog against Anderson. Right? But just understand, Jake Paul, in preparing for AJ, will have been in the ring with an athlete who he can't move away from. Let's talk about the second guy. Now, this is the guy who doesn't fit to me. He has some of the best legs in the heavyweight division. Frank Sanchez. Right? In other words, Jake Paul's picking contenders. Now, Frank Sanchez moves a lot better than Anthony Joshua. I see no scenario in this fight where Joshua decides he's going to have to move away from Jake Paul. If he reaches that stage, then he's in trouble. Right? Frank Sanchez dances around. This is another guy with foot speed where Jake Paul won't be able to move away from him. Now, maybe that's the point of having Frank Sanchez in the ring. Understand, too, Frank Sanchez, crafty, dropped Efe Ajagba in a fight. Look at that fight. Right? He's kind of like a heavyweight version of Devin Haney. In other words, Sanchez is moving. He's moving. An opponent, Regis Prograis, Brian Norman, might get complacent. Then bam! There's a surprise shot. Drops the opponent. But the sparring partner who to me is the most intriguing, between you and me, this is a guy who, at heavyweight, right, not weight trained against Chris Billum-Smith, at heavyweight, given the way he fights, and given the fact that there's a length dynamic to his game. In other words, he's going to come in, he's going to keep you outside. You're going to have a hard time getting by his jab. Right? So, in a division where some guys are tentative, right? AJ's tentative early. I believe that could easily be a problem for AJ here in an 8-round fight. right? A Lawrence Okoli, who has been cruiserweight champion himself, has also been bridgerweight champion, and now is up at heavy. And understand, he's a heavy. This isn't the guy clocking in at 230. This is the guy who's up around 260. Right? Lawrence Okoli is going to spar with Jake Paul. And this is needed. This is the essential sparring partner because Jake Paul is going to have to figure out what to do with AJ's jab. In other words, I believe AJ has to come in jab heavy. 8-round fight, you can't wait. Right? Fights in America. There's going to be a Rocky dynamic where everyone's on Goliath's side early, but then the minute Rocky shows any fight, people are going to switch. They'll want to see the upset. Right? Canelo, Crawford, you know my view on that fight. I'm not going to repeat it here. But I believe AJ needs to come in. He needs to be active, but he needs to be measured. He doesn't want to come in swinging hooks and leaving himself open. He wants to come in and he wants to be active but be surgical. The jab's the punch that does that for a fighter. Right, folks? Lawrence Okoli has one of the best jabs in the heavyweight division. Remember his name, Lawrence Okoli. He's sparring with Jake Paul. Right now, one of the problems in this fight for Jake Paul, and it is a problem, is size. Right? Julio Cesar Chavez, Mike Tyson, who Jake Paul fought, they're not 6'6". Right? That changes everything. AJ doesn't have to be defensively blessed to lean a little bit and make it hard for Jake Paul to land on his chin, especially when he has a jab that Jake Paul has to duck on the way in. Folks, you get the height dynamic with the jab with Lawrence Okoli. Right? This isn't Frank Sanchez who's moving around the ring and stuff like that. This isn't Jared Anderson who might be a little bit reckless. One of the great things is AJ's not defensively blessed, nor is Jared Anderson. Right? So, here you have Jake Paul able to see a guy who might have openings where he then, thinks to himself, well, how can I take advantage of the opening? Folks, it's November 29th. This fight's happening now in less than a month. This is the home stretch. Right? So Jake Paul, in my opinion, has an A-level list of fighters. This is not a guy going for gimmicks. This is an opponent who is in it to win it. He has the athlete guy, Jared Anderson. He has the mover, Frank Sanchez. And he has the jab, the sauce, Lawrence Okoli. Right? So, let me just say, I've looked at the lines. I think the fight's a bit mispriced. I'm hearing AJ was going to fight Cassius Chaney. What I want people to do is to look at Mike, the bounty hunter, against Cassius Chaney. Right? Chaney is a different fight style than Jake Paul. In other words, it would have been different if, AJ was training to fight Frank Sanchez. Right? A guy with feet, right? Foot speed. Then he shifts over. Sanchez gets hurt. He shifts over to Jake Paul. Okay. Style-wise, it kind of makes sense. No, here he was going to fight a stationary Cassius Chaney. Right? He was going to fight a measured Cassius Chaney. Now he's switching over to fighting a guy who has movement, who's in the 220s, right? Who has timing. Post-fight interviews, particularly a day after the fight, are very valuable. And, you know, Mike Tyson, days after his fight against Jake Paul, talked about how he was sore. How in the moment he couldn't feel all the punches, but afterwards, a day or two later, he felt the punches. Now that could be because Mike Tyson's in his 50s. Folks, it could also be because Jake Paul actually has pop. Right? So I need for folks to think this one through. You know, AJ, let's just say the angles of the punches, his height, 6'6". Well, how tall is Lawrence Okoli? Isn't he 6'5"? In other words, you know, Jake Paul will have an opportunity to spar with guys the same type height. And of course, Lawrence Okoli's jab, and I don't consider it a mobile jab, right? This isn't Tyson Fury. They're different kinds of jabs, right? But let's just say Anthony Joshua, apart from the Andy Ruiz rematch, isn't a guy who moves a lot when he throws his jab. And I get the feeling, particularly given that Eddie Hearn is saying he'll be disappointed if the fight goes more than 4 rounds. And let me just point out, not Eddie's best day there, right? You never want to put pressure on a fighter like that, right? Even when you have to sell the fight. But just understand, because of the size gap here, because of the expectation gap here, right? AJ people are wondering whether Jake Paul's even serious about fighting him. This is with Jake Paul having already fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., a champion who went the distance with Canelo at a catch weight. Look that up. Right, so, folks, look at the sparring partners. Ask yourself the cost, right? If I'm going to get Jared Anderson as a sparring partner, how much is it going to cost me? You mean to tell me this guy has Jared Anderson, Frank Sanchez, and Lawrence Okoli? You got to be kidding me. Right? I think Okoli against AJ, that's a damn good fight, folks. That's a highly competitive fight. Just understand, the Sauce is one of the sparring partners for Jake Paul, who's taking this seriously. You should too. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.